tonight's topic is about ethics in the beginning of human life. So we're going to be looking at the process that brought each and every one of us into existence. And we're going to think about how we treat embryos, fetuses, and babies. And we're going to look at how society thinks about this stage of the human existence. Now, people's views are shaped by assumptions about the human person, the behaviors, what makes a person or gives a person value, and their human rights. Now, we're going to unpack some of these assumptions tonight and think about the Christian perspective of them. So before we do this, we're going to watch a quick clip about the movie Gattaca. So this movie came out in 1997, and it starred Jude Law, Ethan Hawke, and I think Uma Thurman, and it looks at this futuristic world where genetics have changed everything, and you are defined by your genes. And if you didn't have the right genes, you were an outcast.
I was conceived in the Riviera, not the French Riviera, the Detroit variety. They used to say that a child conceived in love has a greater chance of happiness. They don't say that anymore. I'll never understand what possessed my mother to put her faith in God's hands rather than those of her local geneticist. 10 fingers, 10 toes, that's all that used to matter. Not now. Now, only seconds old, the exact time and cause of my death was already known.
Neurological condition, 60% probability. Manic depression, 42% probability. Attention deficit disorder, 89% probability. Heart disorder, 99% probability. Early fatal potential. Life expectancy, 30.2 years.
30 years.
The name for this record? Vincent?
From an early age, I came to think of myself as others thought of me.
Vincent?
Chronically ill. Every skinned knee and runny nose was treated as if it were life-threatening.
I'm sorry, the insurance won't cover it. If he fell...
But I was told that everything was...
I really wish there was something I could do.
Like most other parents of their day, they were determined that their next child would be brought into the world in what has become the natural way.
Your extracted eggs, Marie, have been fertilized with Antonio's sperm. After screening, we are left, as you see, with 2 healthy boys and 2 very healthy girls. Naturally, no critical predispositions to any of the major inheritable diseases. All that remains is to select the most compatible candidate. First, we may as well decide on gender. Have you given it any thought?
We would want Vincent to have a brother, to play with.
Of course you would. Hello, Vincent. You have specified hazel eyes, dark hair, and fair skin. I have taken the liberty of eradicating any potentially prejudicial conditions, premature baldness, myopia, alcoholism and addictive susceptibility, propensity for violence, obesity, etc.
We didn't want, diseases, yes, but...
Right. We were just wondering if it's good to just leave a few things to chance.
You want to give your child the best possible start. Believe me, we have enough imperfection built in already. Your child doesn't need any additional burdens. And keep in mind, this child is still you. Simply the best of you. You could conceive naturally 1,000 times and never get such a result.
So this movie came out in 1997, but the future that we imagined isn't that far off to the reality that we live in now. So as Christians, we're going to have to respond to this reality, and to help us, we have Dr. Megan Best to help us think through it. So Dr. Best is a medical doctor who's currently working in palliative care in Sydney. Palliative care is care for patients who have terminal illness, who have reached the extent of their medical care and are in the process of dying. Dr. Best has been involved in medical ethics for over 20 years. And if I get any of this wrong, can you please correct me? Okay, so been involved for over 20 years and holds a Master in Arts and Applied Ethics in Healthcare. So she's currently clinical senior lecturer at the University of Sydney and is a visiting lecturer in medical ethics at the University of New South Wales. She's a scholar at the Centre of Public Christianity and a chair at the Ethics Committee for the Christian Medical and Dental Fellowship for Australia. That is a mouthful.
It is.
So Dr. Best has written papers and articles on many topics, including euthanasia, genetics, stem cell, cloning, assisted reproduction and health resource allocation. She has written 2 books on ethics of reproduction, Fearful and Wonderfully Made, and A Life Already Started. So Dr. Best has been involved with the development of health legislation with the regulation of human embryo research. She's one of Australia's leading Christian bioethicists and has thought a lot about the issues we are facing. So I would just like to welcome Dr. Best up now. Before we start, let's find out some more about her. Can I call you Megan?
You can.
Megan, where are you from?
I'm from Sydney, way on the other side of Australia.
So tell us more about your family.
I'm married to John, who is a sports medicine physician. We have 2 daughters, a son-in-law, and a grand-dog.
So you're a bioethicist.
Yep.
Can you define bioethics for us?
Bioethics, ethics is the study of the process of deciding what is the right way to live, and bioethics is ethics applied to the biological sciences. So mainly I just look at ethics in medicine. What is the right thing to do? How to decide right from wrong.
And how did you become interested in bioethics?
Well, I was always interested in ethics, but I was working in Sydney as a palliative care doctor in the 90s when the euthanasia debate started and just before euthanasia was legalised in Northern Territory. And I knew that the public debate was talking about what it was like for people who were dying, and I knew it was wrong. I knew what it was like for people at the end of life because I looked after them every day at work. So I thought that I was happy for our society to make decisions about the laws of what was going to be legal or not, but I thought that it should be based on the facts, not on these myths that were circulating about how much pain and suffering everyone was experiencing. So I really started to get involved just to make the public debate more based on facts. And then I actually got my training after that when I realised just how many areas of bioethics have been badly informed by what actually goes on.
Wow. So why is bioethics important?
Well, I think bioethics is important for Christians at 3 levels. I think firstly, if we want to live our lives in accordance to what we believe, we need to be able to make good decisions in our own lives. And bioethics is a challenging area because you need to know the facts before you can make good decisions about right and wrong, but because science changes so quickly, it can be challenging for Christians to really understand what's going on at the cutting edge. But I also think it's good to know about bioethics for evangelism because, transgenderism, gay marriage, IVF, these are topics that you might chat about with your friends, and I think it helps to show how God is interested in the flourishing of human beings in the way we discuss these topics, and it can be a good way to help people understand a Christian worldview to our friends. And thirdly, I think that we have the handbook of the Creator, in terms of the best way for human beings to live. So I think that as Christians, we have a lot to say in the public debate about the way medical technology is legislated.
So without giving away spoilers, what do you hope people will take away from tonight's presentation?
I think it's a great confidence that God knows what is best for us and that we can trust His word when it comes to making decisions about important things in our life.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Megan. I'll help to Will.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming along on a rainy evening to listen to this topic, and thanks to AFES for inviting me. It's a real delight to be here in Perth. I wanted to spend the time this evening helping you understand how our community came to think about unborn humans the way it does. I won't be focusing quite so much on the actual technologies. If you are interested in details, this book is very thick and there's a lot of detail there you can go into if you want. But I just want to think for a minute how many unborn humans lose their lives every year through our current technologies. I don't think anyone really knows. Internationally, through abortion and IVF, it must be in the tens of millions. Numbers just too big for us to comprehend. And our rapidly developing ability to manipulate the unborn human is bringing up ethical dilemmas that we've never had to deal with before. I think that we can now create human embryos with no intention of ever allowing them to develop. They can be made explicitly just to be destroyed in research. As you can see from the movie clip from Gattaca, that's not science fiction anymore. We can now take embryos in lab, put them under the microscope and see which ones have the features that we would prefer. What they don't tell you is how many embryos were discarded when parents just say, oh, we'd like to have a boy. So immediately female embryos are discarded, even if they're completely healthy. This happens every day in IVF clinics. We have contraceptives which interrupt embryonic development at early stages. Elective abortion is widespread. If you have the right tablets, you can do it at home. In the literature, arguments are being made that every normal pregnancy should be screened to see if the child has Down syndrome, and only normal babies should be allowed to come to birth. This is what our world is like at the moment. The issue of when human life begins has long been of interest to biologists, but I think it really first came to the attention of the Australian public with the discovery of human embryonic stem cells. Now, I know I'm really old now, but who remembers the stem cell debate? How many of you are aware of what happened in the public stem cell debate, just to give me an idea of how much background I should give you? So there's a bit of knowledge there, okay. So it'll be a history lesson for a lot of you. It's when science research goes on in labs in places like this university, usually the human public don't know anything about what's going on until it spawns some sort of technology which is then released to the public. And that kind of application is more obvious to the layperson. But with stem cell and cloning, it was quite different. To the amazement of the researchers involved, the announcement of the first cloned mammal in 1996 flashed across newspapers worldwide. Dolly the sheep had been born. She was an instant celebrity. Suddenly, science fiction clone dictators seemed less like science fiction. Ethical questions were raised about the notion of cloning, and the researchers just couldn't understand it. Dolly was the first mammal. They hadn't been thinking about ethics when they created Dolly. They were just thinking about making scientific progress. But the thing is, human ethics in research developed after World War II as a result of the Nazi experiments, and it was thought that human beings should never be treated so badly again, and that's how modern medical ethics developed. But it didn't develop in science. And most of the people involved in cloning technology came from a veterinary background, so they knew nothing about human research ethics. So they thought that this whole idea of replicating mammalian cells wasn't anything interested, but it just captured the public imagination the way no science had before. And then in 1998, human embryonic stem cells were isolated, and the idea of regenerative medicine was conceived. And that's the idea that there are some parts of our bodies where cells can die, and there's nothing we can do about it. If you have a heart attack and part of the muscle of your heart dies, that's it. If you have a spinal cord injury and your nerve cells die, we can't replace them. But when cloning technology developed, people thought, we could clone heart muscle cells, and that means that we can just put back the ones that died. The same with the spinal cord. We could replace the dead cells, and then people who couldn't walk would be able to walk again. And it was very exciting, but it wasn't treated the way other new medical therapies were being discussed. The reason for this is that it was realised that the only way we knew how to harvest stem cells in order to use this technology was through growing human embryos and taking out the stem cells, which would kill the embryo. So right from the start it was controversial, because the only way we could get hold of those stem cells was by killing tiny human beings. But why did it unsettle our community so much? At this stage, IVF was being widely used. Abortion was available on demand. It was really strange. Bioethicist Leo Cass famously wrote that when we feel uncomfortable about a new technology, we should stop and think about what it is that is unsettling us before it becomes normalised, and the familiarity of the idea makes us comfortable again. So this perception that things wrong. And there's a lot of confusion now in our society about what is a human embryo, and why do we feel like it's important even though we have all these laws which allows its destruction. And I think we can tell that human beings still feel that human embryos are special in some way. So what I would do tonight is have a biology lesson, so that we can all be on the same page about embryology, and I can show you how a human being develops. And then I will briefly consider the technology and the different ways that we use human beings with current technology. And then we'll consider how the debate has gone in our community, so that we feel that it's okay as a community to destroy human embryos and human fetuses, and which brings us up to date to where we are now. In any Christian ethics, you really need to familiarise yourself with science before you can make informed decisions about what's right and wrong. When we get informed, we lose our credibility. So that's where we'll start now. Development of the embryo, manipulation of the embryo, and the ethics of it all. Now, this is a cross-section of a female reproductive tract, and I have to turn this way. And this is how most of us are conceived. Eggs are released from the ovary. They travel down the fallopian tube. They might bump into some sperm on the way. And then the embryo, once it is fertilized, travels down the fallopian tube to implant in the womb of the female. Egg is more a culinary term than a biological one. The actual name for the female gamete is oocyte, but we'll use egg because it's shorter and more familiar. First step of human conception is the fertilisation of egg by a sperm, and then we have a single cell called a zygote, which creates the first cell of the future individual. And from this point, development is a continuum through pregnancy and childhood to adulthood. So all the DNA you need for the mature human being is present in that single cell. And in embryology, a member of the species Homo sapiens in that tiny cell. Cell organisation begins immediately, even before the genome is activated. So we're not dealing with what is often called just a clump of cells. Beware of the use of language in this topic, because it's often used to misdirect public opinion. This is a fertilised mouth egg, but it's at the point at which the sperm actually enters the egg decides the poles of the egg right from the very beginning. So right from the very first cell, we have signs of organisation. First cell division occurs within 24 hours of conception, and cellular division continues while the embryo fallopian tube towards a womb. By the time it's in the fallopian tube, it's comprised of 4 different types of cell. This is an embryo pictured at the 32 cell stage, and the inner cell mass is the red bump. That's where the stem cells come from. The colours correlate with different tissue types of what will become the embryo and the supporting structures. 5 to 6 days, you have the blastocyst. That's what they use to harvest the stem cells. So it's like a hollow ball of cells with the clump of stem cells inside. At the end of the first week, implantation begins, where the embryo attaches to the uterine wall and the mother's blood starts nourishing. Sadly, this doesn't always occur successfully, in which case you'd have an early miscarriage. In week 3, you have this future spinal cord beginning to develop, and heart tubes begin to fuse, and blood cell production begins in the embryo. Week 4, the embryo measures 3 millimetres in length, and its own heart starts to beat in a regular rhythm. Develop brain, thyroid, eyes and ears begins. You once looked like this. Week 5, we have continued development of eyes, mouth, sinuses, lungs, arms, hands and legs beginning to grow, and the embryo's own blood supply starts to circulate. Week 6, the embryo millimetre length, and we have beginning of formation of the feet, ears, nipples and bones, continued development of the face and the brain. Arms and legs have lengthened, and you can now see feet and hands which have digits, but they might still be webbed. Week 7, the embryo measures 1.3 centimetres. The trunk lengthens, are longer and bent at the elbow, and the kidneys start to develop. Elbows and toes are visible, and if you did an ultrasound, you'd see the arms and legs moving spontaneously. In week 8, the embryo measures 3 centimetres in length. The facial features continue to develop, with eyelids and ears taking shape. They're all rounded. At this stage, we have the beginnings of all essential internal and external structures. And you can see that even while at the embryo stage, an enormous amount of development has already taken place. Now, when it gets to be 8 weeks old, we now call it a fetus embryo. I have a life-size model of a 10-week fetus here, which I'm going to pass around so you can have a good look at it. It's a bit squishy. At 3 months, the fetus reaches just over 8 centimetres, and the face and body are now formed, and all organs are beginning to function. So all that's going to happen for the remainder of the pregnancy after 3 months is just maturation of what's already there. 5 months, tooth enamel's developing, and the pregnant woman can detect fetal movement. The fetus is producing its own hormones, and by now the baby can feel pain, which some babies will feel as early as 17 weeks. Certainly all babies will feel it by 24 weeks. 5 months, the baby might hiccup if they swallow too much amniotic fluid, and the two sides of the brain differentiate asymmetrically. 6 months, hair starts to grow. Gas exchange is possible in the lungs. The sense of smell is functioning. The eyes begin to detect light and can produce tears. Things get a bit squashy in there, and then at 9 months, we hope for a healthy newborn. I don't think anyone would argue that a newborn baby is a human being that deserves protection. So if that was a human being, when did it stop becoming a human being so that it was okay to cut it up for research? I would suggest that it might be a human zygote. International embryologist Ronan O'Reilly has no doubt that in biological terms we're dealing with a human being from the time of fertilisation. This is the man that developed the terminology that's currently used worldwide to classify embryos. He says that although life is a continuous process, fertilization is a critical landmark because under ordinary circumstances, a new genetically distinct human organism is formed when the chromosomes of the male and female pronuclei blend in the egg. This remains true even though the embryonic genome is not actually activated until 2 to 8 cells are present at about 2 to 3 days. During the period proper, milestones include fertilization, activation of the embryonic genome, segregation of embryonic and extra-embryonic cells, implantation, the appearance of the primitive streak and bilateral symmetry. Despite these various embryological milestones, however, development is in a continuous rather than a saltatory or stepwise process. Hence, the selection of prenatal events would seem to be largely arbitrary. What he's saying is that since everything it needed to grow was present from that first cell and it developed independently since then, it would be arbitrary to say that life began at any other time except fertilization. So in biological terms, when the egg and sperm joined together, human life began. Thankfully, this is no longer contested in informed debate. With regard to abortion and embryo destruction in research, it's no longer an argument of whether it's a human being, it's now of when and whether these developing human beings deserve protection. But as you know, a lot of public debate is not well informed, so sadly we need to continue to proclaim the humanity of the unborn human in terms of the embryo and fetus. Now today I'm mainly talking about the embryo, but the same arguments apply to the fetus. So how did we get to the stage of where we are now in the way we treat unborn humans? As I said, I'll talk about it more a bit later, but we now have contraceptives that not only interfere with the egg and the sperm getting together, which is the usual way you'd think a contraceptive against conception. We think, okay, it stops the egg and sperm getting together. We also have some contraceptives that interfere with early embryo development. We have IVF, where it's quite routine for healthy embryos discarded and only the very best preferred embryos to implantation in the mother's uterus. We have over 146,000 babies have been killed by abortion in Western Australia since the laws were changed in 1998. How has the public addressed how we treat unborn humans in the 21st century? Well, obviously at the very centre of the public debate is whether if human beings deserve to be protected at this early stage, whether they have a right to life. Now, this disagreement can be best understood when we think of different ways of categorising the embryo. So firstly, we've had the biological definition. As we've already seen, there's no doubt in biological terms that we're dealing with a human being from the time of fertilisation. From the time it's created, the embryo is a unified, unique, dynamic, self-directed whole. This isn't even vaguely controversial in embryological terms. But if there's no doubt biologically that it's a human being, how is it okay to destroy it so wantonly? The question is generally discussed in terms of the philosophical definition. So protagonists of embryo destruction have suggested that protection is only due to human persons and that personhood is not achieved merely on grounds of biology. The concept of human personhood probably has its roots in Greek thought, but for much of its history, personhood was understood to mean an individual being with a rational nature. Explained by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, one who possesses human nature is someone who possesses a rational nature, even if they are unable to freely express it at the time. Therefore, if you are a human being, you are automatically a human person. And really that is the view that's been held for most of history. Until recently, it was inconceivable to suggest that you had a human being who was not a human person. But the definition of personhood underwent a change last century when political expediency intervened. In 1954, the Reverend Joseph Fletcher published an account of human personhood that claimed that in order to be a human person, it wasn't enough to merely have a rational nature, but you had to be able to express it at the time. Fletcher's definition was driven less by scientific discovery than about the political debate around abortion. He wanted to have arguments to make abortion acceptable. And if you said that you didn't have a human being in the womb, it wasn't such a crime to get rid of it. If the embryo was not a fully human person, the abortion was much easier to justify. And Fletcher argued that what sets humans apart from other animals is their possession of reason. And he claimed that this is what grounds human dignity and is signified by the term person. He went on to argue that the human is not a human person, and then that means it didn't deserve legal protection. For Fletcher, the possession of human nature with the latent ability to reason, that is, the non-active ability to reason, was insufficient. As not only embryos and fetuses, but also newborn infants would have to be classed as non-persons. He explicitly accepted that infanticide, or the killing of infants, the killing of newborn babies, would be justifiable on these grounds. Those in a prolonged coma, revival sleep, would likewise be excluded from personhood status. You see how dangerous this thinking is. Well, in response to his argument, I'd suggest that surely this is an unacceptable way to treat newborn human beings. And it's certainly unacceptable as a way to decide which humans deserve protection in our legal system. Intuitively, we know that killing an infant is wrong. Traditionally, those who are unable to speak up for those are those most deserving of protection in our society. And this suggests we should stick with the standard definition of person, that is a living human being. If you're a human being, you're a human person, that is a living human being. And you have a rational nature, even if you're unable to express it at the time. Now, there are many, once you get rid of the idea that the very beginning or fertilisation is the beginning of human life, it's just been open slather for philosophers to work out, okay, well, when does it start? And so we've had varying starting points suggested, such as fertilisation, implantation, when the egg first joins to the blood of the mother, 12 to 14 days, we'll get to that one in a minute. Quickening, or when the mother could first feel the baby moving in the womb, Aristotle said 40 days. Viability, when the baby is first able to survive outside the womb by itself. Birth, and there are even philosophers still writing that Peter Singer, an Australian philosopher, for instance, thinks that parents should be given at least a month after a baby's born to decide if they really want it or not. And he thinks that infanticide is quite acceptable. Generally, these theories require the unborn child to have particular features or abilities before being considered protection. Notice how many of these requirements are not even intrinsic qualities of the fetus. Quickening, the ability of the mother to feel it. When is a baby viable? That really depends on the technology that's available in the place where the baby is born, and it's got nothing to do with the intrinsic qualities of the baby. But on these competing theories continues without any sign of resolution. And then we just have some light relief. Personally, I agree with O'Reilly. Yes, each one of those points is a significant milestone in the life of being involved, and there will be many more significant moments to come. But once you go beyond fertilisation, that's all it is. The next stage, then the one after that, and they go on one after another. But the ideas that have most influenced international debates on when human life begins and how we should treat human embryos were those proposed by the Warnock Committee in the United Kingdom in 1984. While acknowledging that embryonic humans should have a special status, the committee decided to avoid answering the question of what was an embryo and instead decided to discuss it decided not to discuss when human life began. Instead, it just discussed how should we treat the human embryo. Now, despite criticisms of that approach, I mean, how do you know how to treat it if you don't actually know what it is? The committee's recommendation that destructive human embryo was acceptable up to 14 days has influenced policy ever since. It's certainly what on the basis for the Australian legislation. So the introduction of IVF in the United States was approved also after putting aside the question of the moral status of the embryo. And interesting, around these times, the longest anyone had ever grown a human laboratory was 14 days. Isn't that convenient? The Warnock Committee decided that they couldn't decide on a point at which human life began or when human personhood started. So they decided that there was this concept of emerging personhood, where personhood increased with the development of the embryo. They chose their time limit on the grounds that 14 days was when the primitive streak or the beginning of the nervous system was visible in the embryo. And also the time when twinning was no longer possible, because how could you say you have, in fact, you may still have two, an embryo, and at that stage they thought that twinning would happen spontaneously any time in the first 2 weeks. Of course, this science is now out of date. As we've already seen, we now know that the human embryo is organised from the very first day, and furthermore, epigenetics can now demonstrate whether twinning is destined to occur way back at the beginning of embryogenesis. However, the Warnock report remains influential, and its assumptions have permeated the United Kingdom's most recent review of their embryo research legislation, and the 14-day rule has been confirmed as an ethical principle by various governments' ethics committees around the world. Now, the interesting thing to us in the literature about the 14 is that it doesn't seem to make anybody happy, regardless of whether they think an embryo deserves protection or not. According to people who don't think you should experiment on embryos, they say, well, 14 days is unacceptable because the embryo should be protected right from the start. And the people who think that research is justified saying, well, why do we have to wait 14 days? Either it's okay to an experiment on an embryo or it isn't. And what's the 14 days about? So nobody's happy. And how to decide which is correct? Certainly not the researchers. So let's stop for a moment and see what we have so far as the basis for the way we decide how to treat developing human embryos. Out-of-date science. Very little, if any, public discussion has occurred about what we now know about early development of human beings. When have you seen in the news any updates on how intricately the human being is fashioned from the time of fertilisation? And secondly, we have a philosophical debate that has an agenda to create an artificial standard of what a human being must achieve before it's okay for it to get protection from the government. Philosophical argument ultimately underlying this thinking is the ethical theory of consequentialism, that the end justifies the means. Our community has decided that while it's regrettable that we might destroy human beings in abortion, in an IVF clinic, the potential consequences of their destruction, possible medical cures through research, a girl able to get on with her life because of abortion. These potential benefits justify their use. And some proponents would go so far as to suggest the potential benefits make it unethical not to pursue avenues of medical research that involve the destruction of human embryos. But saying you might as well use unwanted embryos for research depends on the idea that the human embryo is not a human person deserving protection. Of course, an extension of the idea that the species Homo sapiens deserves no special treatment, that we are not exceptional, that we are just an accident or an unguided evolutionary process, that we don't have a creator in whose image we are made. So that you can trace these arguments right back to a quite alternative science. Now, before I finish this section, I'd just like to say that there are many people who support the destruction of embryos, who are trying to advance IVF, who are not necessarily monsters who don't care what happens to unborn babies. Most of the ones that I've met are driven by the desire to help their patients. They honestly don't believe that a human being isn't. And the reason they think that is it's because it's what they were taught at university. They don't think they're destroying a human being, and that's why they're not bothered. What happened was that in 1972, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology deliberately changed the definition of conception so that instead of starting at fertilisation, it began with implantation, which you'll remember is about 7 to 10 days after fertilisation. This was done to widen the market of contraceptives. If you could say there was no pregnancy present, any drug stopping the embryo from developing, technically still a contraceptive. So rather than having to just focus on things that stop the egg and the sperm coming together, a contraceptive was anything that could operate to interrupt the development of that embryo up to the time it was actually implanted in the uterus. The full story is in the book. They didn't have the authority to influence this definition. They weren't embryologists. But if you now look in medical textbooks, you'll find it saying that conception is equivalent to implantation and that pregnancy starts then. Whereas if you look in an embryology textbook, conception is at fertilisation and that's when human life begins. And this is still the case now. Other concerns with a lot of the bioethical debates to do with unborn humans are that we often have superficial and ill-informed public debates. The newspapers will just dumb down any bioethical discussion that we seem to have so that it's a very simple right and wrong answer. Look at how Andrew Denton's treating euthanasia at the moment. And the complexity of the arguments can often be lost. This is certainly what happened when it came to the stem cell debate, when it comes to some of the issues in IVF and genetic screening of embryos. It's certainly the current screening of all normal pregnancies to make sure that no Down syndrome children are born was represented in the Women's Week. Science has come up with a new development to make sure that no baby need be born with Down syndrome anymore. It sounds like a cure, doesn't it? But it's not. There are also scientists often, when they have a discovery in the lab, often it's just goes into the media as if it's some new therapy. We've seen this cancer, but it also happened with stem cells, where they discovered embryonic stem cells in the lab and suddenly it was all about how people in wheelchairs would soon be able to walk. And even people who were in favour of stem cells were a bit embarrassed by some of the claims that were made for the science. But this is certainly one of the things that drives governments to change their laws so that it's okay for scientists to experiment on human embryos. And also, we're told that if we don't develop technologies such as genetic screening of embryos in Australian laboratories, the scientists will go overseas and we will lose all the money in Australia that comes from their work. So the financial incentive for allowing experimentation on human embryos regularly comes up in the... So how are we to think about this type of of discussion. I think at worst, a lot of our ethical discussions are misguided. I think at best they're misguided. At worst, sometimes it's just manipulative hype to stop the public from really knowing what's going on. And this makes it really difficult for Christians, because if we want to make good decisions about our own reproductive lives, we really need to understand what's going on to decide right from wrong. It's always a challenge to get to the facts of these issues, particularly when we're dependent on the media for information, and any fool can put something on the internet. And it's a challenge for church and knowledgeable Christians who can talk about it. So I'd say for those of you who are involved with biological sciences that you may be someone who can learn a bit more about this. I am happy to share my lovely pictures slides with anybody who wants them. And you can give talks at your church just to try and help Christians think through these issues. We're in exciting times because the way Christians live is going to be difficult to hide from our non-Christian friends, because we will have to make choices that are out of line with what everyone else does. And I think that this is a great opportunity for us to learn to live out our Christian witness. So how are we going to think about these topics? Well, Christians have a moral compass, and that's the Bible. And we can learn a lot about the way God wants us to treat humans by considering the way that we've been made. And the creation story in Genesis shows us that all human beings are made in the image of God. And it's on this basis that we are all to be treated equally and with dignity. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Human beings have been uniquely made in the image of God, in God's likeness, and this sets us apart from the other creatures who were made according to their kinds. In contrast to the modern philosophical view that personhood must be earned, the Bible teaches us that our personhood is inherent because of the nature of the God whose image we reflect. We're to treat all human beings with respect for the whole of their lives, regardless of their particular characteristics. It is not our respect that gives us dignity. Rather, it's because they have innate dignity that we owe them respect. But when does it begin? If we can accept the life of a human being starts before birth, but there's no key verse in the Bible that tells us exactly when it begins. The Bible isn't a scientific textbook. But it's certain that human life begins before birth. The Bible makes a link between conception and birth in many places, such as Genesis 4, where Adam lay with his wife Eve and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. It's pretty basic, but it's there. In Israel 46, God speaks to Israel as you whom I've upheld since you were conceived and have carried since your birth. Jesus' presence on earth is a powerful reminder of the status that embryos hold in the eyes of God, because in order to take on full human likeness, Christ had to commence life as an embryo rather than as a fully functioning human. The Bible describes the relationship we have with God while we're still in the womb, such as during our formation. There's that wonderful passage in Psalm 139. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. There's a similar description in Job 10. These are only a sample of the Bible verses which illustrate these points. And in the book, my first book, I've really looked at a lot of the verses that describe the unborn human. There is no doubt that in the Bible, the unborn human is recognised as one who can have a relationship with God. Furthermore, the Bible tells us that it does not justify the means. Romans 3 refutes the notion that we should do evil so that good might result. It is not okay to kill human embryos to create a cure for other humans. Exodus 20 says we shouldn't kill innocent human beings, regardless of the consequences. It's one of the 10 commandments. The Bible tells us that the value of a human being is based on our own understanding of morality as given to us by God who made us. We were all once embryos too. So then we think, well, how do we decide about the laws of how we treat unborn humans in our community? Well, what are our options? At the heart of this whole issue is the moral status of the human embryo. Well, it was interesting. We had all this time when we were fighting about human embryos, deciding, how should they be treated? What are we going to do if the only way to get these treatments to fix spinal cords and heart muscles requires of human embryos? There were those of us saying it's not okay, and the other people were saying, you don't care about people in wheelchairs. And we're saying, well, yes, we do, but we also care about human embryos. And we just couldn't come to any agreement. But it's now known that stem cell research was able to proceed without the embryos being destroyed. We discovered human adult stem cells, which can be harvested from an adult human, the one to be treated, which was actually avoided a lot of complications. And we realised we'd been doing it for years in bone marrow transplants. So that's now, there are hundreds of therapies that have been developed using that time. Also, some Japanese discovered an equivalent to embryonic stem cells called induced pluripotent stem cells, or IPS cells, which look like embryonic stem cells and act like embryonic stem cells. And that discovery wasn't completely unexpected, because in the history of Western science, ethical limits have led to imaginative solutions rather than remaining barriers to discovery. We have to hold on to the truth that God has given us with confidence that He will find us a way out without having to break His laws. However, even in the light of the discovery of these alternatives to stem cells, for instance, most scientists rejected suggestions for embryonic stem cell research, and so the withdrawal of permissive legislation and redirecting of funding to other sources of research didn't happen. Probably if you wanted that to happen, you'd need a high-profile celebrity to get behind the cause. And who? Dr. Oz. The day he told Oprah about IPS cells, you can see how excited she is. But it would have been better if we had stopped this kind of research at the ethic committee stage. And so my challenge to you is to say that if you are still awake, you are an excellent candidate for an ethics committee. Who was on the committee when they first decided to grow human embryos in the lab? If someone then had said, don't be ridiculous, we can't grow humans for research, we may never have been stuck with some of these problems. There is a place on human research ethics committees for people who are ministers of religion, members of the public, doctors. I'm sure most of you will fall into one of those categories. And if we can get more Christians to be involved at this level of research, we can make sure we have more transparency. And when you think, but I'm a Christian and I'm a minority in this society, what if I say, why should anyone listen to me? We have the hand data. We are interested in human flourishing. We have something to say which is going to be of great benefit to our community, and we shouldn't let them shut us down just because they don't agree with us. We need to have confidence that what we are contributing in the public square is something that people really will benefit from hearing. We need more transparency in science. There we are, we'll let Oprah go. This shows us the feet of a 10-week-old fetus, the same size as the one we've been passing around. You can count the toes. We need to let our community know that things have changed, that our understanding of embryology has changed, and that the justifications of the past are no longer valid. It's time to think again, not just about stem cells, but debates on how we use IVF. We're talking about screening every embryo, discarding the ones that don't suit the preferences of the adults. We have genetic screening that not only screens life-threatening problems of the unborn, but we also are screening for some conditions which won't have any chance of developing to adulthood. Screening for some types of breast cancer, are we saying the first 50 years of that child's life are going to be useless? just because we have the confidence that at some stage, if they don't get knocked over by a bus, they're going to get breast cancer. We're checking for conditions that have what we call partial penetration. So it's just a chance that they might get an abnormality. It's not even definite that they're going to get that genetic abnormality actually displayed in their phenotype. So I think that a lot of the public are just not aware of what's going on. We've got screening happening in every normal pregnancy looking for genetic abnormalities, and often women don't know what it is that the tests are for, and the first thing they find out is that your child has a risk of Down syndrome and we recommend an abortion. I was told to abort my second child, who is now a happy, healthy girl just about to finish her qualification. And who knows how much pain and suffering is being caused. The grieving of a woman who aborts a child because of a disability that's been shown up on prenatal screening, the logical pain has been measured to be similar to that of having a stillborn child. This is tremendous suffering that is going on in our community. We need our legislators to be aware of what their decisions involve. We need debates about personhood so that we have to acknowledge as a community it's just an excuse to justify what some people wanted to do anyway. These are all artificial categorisations, and we don't talk about it in the community. And I think that it's time that some of these things were discussed a bit more openly. But we live in a fallen world, and the only real cure for a materialistic worldview is the gospel. But failing this, how do we find consensus as a community? I would suggest it's not possible. In the end, the moral status of the embryo is not a fact, but a value. Each of us will decide what is valuable to us on the basis of our worldview. Those who would pursue destruction of human embryos, of human fetuses before birth, are considering the consequences of some cures from research on embryos, the consequences of a woman being free to live a life without a child that she didn't plan to have. The freedom of a parent who can have a child confident that they won't develop a genetic malady. Those opposed to destruction of human embryos and developing human fetuses are considering the act itself, that there are some things you should never do, regardless of the consequences. They will never meet by talking about different things, consequences and actions. In a pluralistic society, we cannot just ignore the people that we disagree with. We have to consider all the views in our community, but often when there is no consensus, we just take a vote and the person with the most votes wins. We need to keep trying to win that vote. And so I would say that there is to stand up and be counted. There's a Rally for Life in just a couple of weeks here in Perth. You can stand up and say that you think human life is valuable. At the same time, we need to be sensitive in our discussions with our friends and in the way we talk about these issues, because they are painful issues that are getting touched on and they affect real people, and we do need to be sympathetic to those who are caught in difficult circumstances. Sometimes require imaginative ways of dealing with some of these problems. Ways of supporting young women who feel that they can't support a baby and that was the reason they wanted to have an abortion. Ways of supplying more public funds available to children with disabilities so that parents don't feel the need to ensure that they have a perfectly normal child that's born. But our message is a positive one. Let's keep saying yes to human life at every stage of development. And I think that if we can do more ourselves, it is a challenge to the church, but there is so much more that we could be doing to help those who are caught in these dilemmas where they are tempted by modern technologies that speak to problems that are real, that desire for a child that drives people into IVF, the desire for a cure that may make someone donate embryos for research. We need to be sympathetic to that, but we also need to provide practical ways of support so that more people in our community can say yes to this little one who is fearfully and wonderfully made. Thank you. The first one is an easy one. Details on the walk and rally for life. It's on the evening of Tuesday the 17th of May, sitting at this cathedral and going up to Parliament House. What advice for Christian couples considering IVF? My first advice for anyone considering IVF as a Christian is expect to be treated as a nuisance, because you are going to be pushing against the mainstream all the way through. Quite logically, the doctors working in IVF clinics want success for their patients. They are genuinely interested in trying to help a couple with infertility have a child. And so they are going to be recommending to that couple everything they can think of to increase the chances of success. And a couple who have been struggling with infertility, it's particularly hard for Christians in a church full of children's programs to be struggling with infertility. So they are emotionally vulnerable at the time they go to those clinics, and they are going to be open to suggestions to increase their success rates. And that's why it's so important for people going into such a situation to think through some of the ethical challenges before they start. For example, I recommend that people going IVF who have a high risk for the human embryo only create as many embryos as you are prepared to have children. Now, some couples with stimulation of ovulation may end up with 20 embryos, but they're not going to want to have 20 children usually. And so I've had one woman come to me, she's got a beautiful family of 4 children, 10 frozen embryos. Every one of her embryos has taken. So if she transfers 10 more, she'll end up with 14 children, as likely as not. So she's got a real dilemma because she didn't think ahead. So that's one area where you have to think about how many embryos you create. You're going to have to fight for the life of each of those embryos, because you choose the ones that look strong and discard the rest and just freeze the strong ones for future use if the first ones don't take. And if you want all your embryos to have a chance of life, as I would expect you would if you had a high view of the human embryo, you're going to have to argue with your doctors, because you're going to want all your embryos to be transferred to the uterus one at a time, and that might upset his success rate statistics. So they're not going to really be very happy about you doing things that they don't think are going to work. Also, but that's partly because they just want you to do the things they think are going to work. But there are a lot of anecdotal stories of where the embryo that everyone thought was going to die is the one embryo that provides a couple with a child. If you want to know the details, read the book, but the way they actually work out which are the strong is very reliable. There are things like the genetic screening I talked about. There are some IVF clinics now that think every couple should have their embryos genetically screened, but it's with the understanding that you only choose the good ones for transfer. So just remember that there are lots of steps that you go through in this process of IVF. It is possible for Christian couples to have IVF and respect human life, but it'll be a fight, so just be prepared for that. The next question, if there's an extra question, just stick up a hand and we'll take you intermittently. Otherwise, I'll just keep working my way through the list. Next one, what are some options for discarded embryos? Well, if you do find yourself like that lady with 10 extra embryos, you can just go on having them transferred one at a time. That's quite a daunting prospect if you've got a large number of embryos. As one lady said to me, I only have to deal with them one time, and that is what some people choose to do. Some people just decide that then they really don't know what to do, and they end up just not deciding anything. And that was one of the reasons why people first thought about experimenting on human embryos, was the number of spares was building up in the IVF clinics, because people just kept paying the money every month for the storage of their frozen embryos because they kept putting off the decision of what to do about them. And then they'd move and the clinic couldn't find them to get the payment, and they were leftover embryos that no one was claiming. There are hundreds of thousands of discarded embryos frozen in clinics around the world as a result. So not deciding anything has been an option for a lot of people. In Australia, you can donate your embryo for research purposes, and it will be in destructive embryo research. There are a few labs that are working on stem cells, but that's much more difficult than anyone ever expected, so it's not very popular. Some people use it just for quality control in the lab, and sometimes there are technicians who are just learning how to take the cells out for genetic screening purposes. So there are different ways that they are used. Sometimes they are allowed to succumb, which is the word that you use in this situation, to say that you just take the embryos out of the freezer and leave them on the bench and let them thaw and they die. The last option is to donate your embryos, and there's a group in Australia called the Embryo Donation Network, which has been started up to save the lives of these human embryos and arrange for them to be donated to another couple who then take over the costs of storage and IVF to have them transferred if they are unable to produce embryos of their own, or they decide that they want to save the life of an embryo rather than starting from IVF from scratch. So they're your options. What do non-Christians use for a moral compass when they're on ethics committees? Good question. Well, I don't know how much ethics we have. In every ethical decision, you start off with your motive, which prompts you to act, which then gives rise to an intention where you decide what you want to do. Then you have your action, and then there are consequences. So there are 4 steps in every ethical decision. And depending on the framework that you use for your decision making, you may think that one of these is more important. So I said that consequences are the way a lot of people in our community decide right from wrong. So if you've got a good outcome, then that was a right decision. Of course, this means that people can look at the same situation and come up with different moral decisions for the same situation. So let's consider euthanasia, where you have 2 people who are motivated by compassion to do something for someone who is suffering, and they both have the intention to stop the suffering. One person may decide the way that I make my decisions is on consequences. So I am intending something this person. If I stop something, that's a good consequence, so it's a right action. They say the way I'm going to stop the suffering of this person is to kill them with a lethal injection. So they're going to approve of euthanasia. Personally, I'm motivated by compassion as well. My intention is to relieve the suffering, but I don't want to hurt the patient. I just want to relieve their suffering. I think killing someone is wrong. I think actions are important as well as consequences. So I'm going to give the person medication to relieve their symptoms so they're no longer suffering, and that they won't be suffering. But because I think actions are important, I will choose differently to the person who thinks only consequences are important. So depending on how you balance out those different steps will change the way you make your moral decisions. Some people focus on consequences. Some people have a list of rules like the major religions. Some people will think about virtues and how a virtuous person would behave. And if you think about all your theories of ethics, everybody has some framework by which they decide right from wrong. A lot of people don't think enough about their own ethics to know what it is, but everyone will have some type of framework. I think for those of you who do know about ethics, I think the Bible teaches a modified virtue ethic where our motives are love of God and love for others. We know from places like Matthew 5 that both intentions and actions are important to God. He can see our hearts as well as see our and consequences. Will be looking for justice and God's standards of social justice for the community. So we don't do things regardless. Even though we think consequences aren't the most important things, we still consider consequences because of our love for our neighbour. So it depends on what your framework is, how you make ethical decisions. Is it all right for Christians to use contraception? You will back to the pictures that I showed you of how human life develops. You might remember that we started off with fertilisation, where the egg and the sperm get together, and that's when I said human life begins in our current level of knowledge. And that over a week, the sperm travels down the fallopian tube and establishes itself in the uterine wall of the mother. And that's implantation, and that's where a lot of people in the medical world now back in 1972. There are going to be two types of contraceptives in ethical terms. We will have the type of contraceptive that works up to the time of fertilisation. A sperm or an egg individually is not morally significant. It doesn't matter what happens to them. We know sperm get wasted all the time. Women have a limited number of eggs, but sorry, I am female. But an egg or a sperm individually aren't morally significant. It's to make an embryo that they're morally significant. So anything that stops the egg and the sperm from getting together is going to be an ethically permissible contraceptive. So things that stop sperm generally are the barrier contraceptives. Things that stop eggs from coming onto the scene are drugs that suppress ovulation, different types of hormonal variations that are available. So they're the main types, and they will stop the egg and the sperm from getting together, and they're the true contraceptives. But then we have this period between fertilisation and implantation where, according to the medical textbooks, it's still a contraceptive, but we know there is a human embryo that is potentially alive at that stage. So anything that interferes with the development of the human embryo after fertilisation is not going to be ethically permissible for a Christian. So we're talking about anything that interferes with the lining of the uterus, that helps the egg get uterine. Anything that stops the embryo from travelling down the fallopian tube. So things like IUDs, which can cause a toxic environment in the fallopian tube, or some of the hormone drugs that can interfere with the lining of the uterus, will not be ethically permissible. Now, the problem with this is that there are some drugs we just don't fully understand how they work. Some of the morning after pills, some of the hormone compilations, for example. And I'm going to mention, because a lot of people ask me about the rumour that the oral contraceptive pill causes early abortions. This is, it's necessary to know a bit about how the oral contraceptive pill works to understand the arguments, but basically the oral contraceptive pills, or the pill, has three methods of actions. Firstly, it thickens the mucus on the cervix to stop the sperm from swimming through. It suppresses ovulation, so there's no egg. And it also thins the lining on the uterus. So some people have said, if first of those action fails, so there's no thickening of the mucus and the sperm get through, and the second action fails and ovulation isn't suppressed, so you have an egg, you can potentially have an embryo. And then if the third function does work, it will thin the lining on the uterus and implantation will be affected and that embryo won't be allowed to develop. So that's the logic of the pill causes abortions. Personally, I think if the first action doesn't work, and your sperm spinning towards the fallopian tube, the second action doesn't work, The spike in hormones that comes with ovulation is what causes the thickening of the lining of the uterus. So you can't have a situation where the second of those methods of action fails, but the third one works. They are going to either work together or fail together. You can't have both at the same time because they're linked by that hormone surge that comes with releasing of the egg connected to the lining of the uterus. Now the situation is, we don't have any evidence that the pill causes abortions. We also don't have evidence that it definitely doesn't, because the research required hormones and thickening of uterus hasn't been done, and the only people with enough money to sponsor a large enough trial for it to be done are the drug companies, and they aren't particularly interested in finding out. So at this stage, the research hasn't been done. We don't know exactly how it worked. So it's really an individual decision about how much information you need to make a decision about using the pill or not. I do think it is an important question because it's an easily reversible, easily accessible contraceptive measure that lots of people use. Modern science is such that we take a representative sample, we see what happens with that sample, and we extrapolate on a basis of likelihood of what the truth is for a particular method of action of a drug. We don't test every single case of people using that drug to see what happens. So the odds are that it doesn't cause abortions, but we can't definitely say it doesn't. And so I don't think you should go against your conscience. I think you should look at yourself and see which of those arguments you're with. But it is a difficult situation for some contraceptives because, as I said, we make our decisions about right and wrong based on the facts, and if you don't have the facts, you're really stuck. And it is a problem for some contraceptives. But I believe the Bible says, I don't think there's anything in the Bible that says you can't use contraceptives, which is the next question. We have Onan spilling his seed in the Old Testament. I believe that his refusal to honour his brother rather than the fact that he used the withdrawal method of contraception. And we're told that even though sex is important in marriage, in 1 Corinthians 7, it is okay for couples to spend time apart for a brief time for purposes of prayer. So it's not as if we can't spend time not having sex when we're married. We know the way God made us, that women are not going to be fertile for a long time in their marriage, because there'll be a period each month where they're not fertile, and once you have menopause, you're not fertile. So it's not as if God created us so we could have as many children as possible in our lifetime. And the reason Catholics think that we can't have contraception goes back to Genesis and the purposes of marriage and the purposes of sex within marriage. So the Catholic argument the Roman Catholic argument would be that the purpose of sex in marriage is for unity, companionship, also for reproduction, going back to Genesis 1. Because Eve was created for Adam as a companion, and that they were called to fill the earth. Now, the Roman Catholic Church has decided that every act of intercourse within marriage should be open to giving birth to a child, and so contraception is wrong because you should always have that option of conceiving. Whereas evangelicals would say that all marriage, the purpose of sexual intercourse is for building unity, which will grow with time, and that the marriage does need to be open to children at some stage, but not necessarily every single act of intercourse. So that's where the difference comes in the different parts of the church. Any questions from the floor yet? No? Okay. Should abortions be a situation where the mother is put at risk? This is a very good question, because right at the moment there's a bill being put forward in the Victorian Parliament saying there should be no abortions allowed in second and third trimesters, basically. This is why it's important to know the facts so that we don't lose credibility in the public debate. Because there will be situations where the only way to save a mother's life is by ending her pregnancy. The most common ones would be eclampsia, high blood pressure, which can occur quite suddenly. And who's seen Downton Abbey? That first daughter, Sybil, she died from that. It can happen. So, I know she'd had the baby. But they should have induced her early when the GP said he was onto the right thing. Now, both the life of the baby and the life of the mother are important and should be preserved if possible. But if the mother develops a condition where her life ends and the baby's not viable, can't live outside the womb, if the mother dies, the baby's going to die anyway because the baby can't survive without the mother. So if you don't do anything in that situation, they're both going to die. Sometimes it's possible to treat the mother's condition and keep things going long enough for the baby to get to the point of viability. And a situation might be, for example, if the mother has cancer and she needs chemotherapy, you might be able to delay treatment or give an alternative safe for the baby and get the baby up to the point of viability. That's the best scenario. But if you can't get keep the mother safe up to the point where the baby can be born safely, you have this situation where either you're going to lose both lives or you will just lose one life, and that will be the baby's life. And sadly, in that situation, I believe it is ethically correct to terminate the pregnancy, lose the life of the baby in order to save the life of the mother. And I believe it's ethically correct. And I believe that it is wrong to say that we are going to ban all terminations of pregnancy after 20 weeks, because there will be some situations when it's ethically correct. And that won't happen very often, but I think it's important that that is allowable under the law if that situation does arise. I'm through these questions here.
Okay, well, I've got a follow-up to that one. Let's follow up on that.
Yeah.
Is there ever, I know I've already come across it, is there ever in real life where there's actually the choice between saving the baby and saving the mother?
I can't think of one. Can anyone else think of one? No? I can't think of one. No one's putting their hand up. I thought about that when I was writing the book. I can't think of one. If you let me know, I'll put in next edition.
We have another question.
Okay.
Along with the life of the mother, reasons for allowing abortion are rape and incest. Are they ethically reasonable decisions, or does the life of the child always trump?
Just repeat the question.
I'm sorry, I forgot to repeat the last question. Okay. Which was, is there ever a situation where you save the life of the child but not the mother? No, the other way around. You know what I mean. Okay, this question, what about rape and incest? The circumstances of a child's conception does not affect its moral status, so the child is going to be morally significant regardless of how it came to be born. This is a very difficult situation, and the care of a woman who has been raped or abused is one that is complex and needs to be done very sensitively. It doesn't happen often enough that someone is raped or sexually abused and become pregnant that we have any significant data on outcomes. What we have is anecdotal. And from the anecdotes, women who've been assaulted experience abortion for a subsequent pregnancy as a second assault. And the outcome tends to be better if they bring the child to birth. It appears to be better for the mother's well-being not to through that second assault. However, not all women are able to subsequently raise the child because of memories the child will bring of the original assault. So sometimes it may be necessary for that woman to arrange for that child to be raised by someone else through adoption or some other arrangement, formal adoption or informal adoption. And I think that whatever is best for the women involved, the way that would be chosen. But it is interesting that women who are assaulted and then have an abortion just don't seem to do as well. But as I said, this is anecdotal evidence. We really don't have enough information statistically to be able to say anything dogmatically. But it's a tragic situation that needs to be handled as sensitively as possible.
Question, kind of following up on some of the previous questions. Another very, very difficult situation, if the mother question is a child that has been used, and carrying the baby to a full term could very potentially endanger their health if they're small enough or at a young enough stage that could be. That's the thing, isn't it? Or have I got that completely wrong?
The question was, what if the child is the female who has been assaulted and impregnated is herself a child, and it would be dangerous for her to carry the child to term. I never heard of a case where a woman's age affected her ability to carry a baby to term. In the past, mothers were much younger than they tend to be today. But what can be a consideration is if the child is physically small and has a small pelvis, you may have to look at an early delivery or alternative methods of delivery, such as a caesarean section. And certainly a child who becomes pregnant in those situations would require very close monitoring through the pregnancy.
What about in the cases of abortion and mental health? If the woman is an endangerment to herself while is carrying the child?
The evidence that we have is that the rate of mental health problems in terminating a pregnancy are higher than those of continuing a pregnancy. That's what the data shows us unequivocally. Obviously, if you felt there was an individual in a different situation, you have to monitor very closely, and I won't be dogmatic on this. It will have to be taken very carefully, but I do say that has been used as a loophole to allow legal abortion in many situations, saying that the abortion is done on grounds of the mother's health, and if done during the pregnancy, then having the abortion. But it's a very controversial issue because the facts have been suppressed for a long time in the medical literature because of the pro-abortion lobby. I don't think there's any question that it's been suppressed.
Okay, Chelsea, I think you had this first.
I wanted to ask if there's any statistics taken when someone has an abortion, like why are they having the abortion? And if so, is there any counselling beforehand, and is it compulsory?
Very good questions. The questions are statistics kept of who has abortions and why they have abortions, and what's the situation regarding the need for counselling before having abortions? The only state in Australia that keeps comprehensive statistics about abortions is South Australia, and that data shows that the majority of abortions occur in the context of a healthy mother and a healthy child in first trimester. The overwhelming reasons as the data shows us why women have abortions is because for one or another they don't feel they could cope with having a baby. Maybe they don't feel they are mature enough. They may not be financially secure in order to raise a child by themselves. They may be kicked out by their family when their family finds out they're pregnant. Maybe a partner is pressuring a woman to have an abortion and she fears she'll lose the relationship if she carries the child. And abortion occurs with a high incidence of domestic violence. So I think we have to be sympathetic to who choose to have abortions in those settings. And that's why there is such a big place for churches filling that gap of supporting women who feel they have to have an abortion because they can't manage. No other state carries comprehensive statistics. In fact, the Medicare numbers for abortion are the same Medicare item numbers used for a whole lot of other procedures, so that we can't even track it through the Medicare numbers. And I think this is a scandal, and I am doing some to try and change that, but that even though abortion's fine and there's no reason to change the law, somehow there's a stigma, and it's wrong to identify women with a Medicare item number to show they've had an abortion. So there's a very mixed message coming through on that at the moment. There's a little bit of data collected in Western Australia about abortions occurring after 20 weeks, but it's not made public. And nobody else collects the statistics. Counselling is supposed to occur because an abortion is a surgical procedure, and according to the NHMRC in Australia, if a doctor performs a procedure on a woman without her fully informed consent, he can be charged with assault, battery and assault. Have we got any legal students here? Is that what it is? Assault and battery? Something like that. Anyway, he can be charged. So you would think that they need to be fully informed to consent for such a procedure, but in fact, it's not well. And the people who do a lot of post-abortion counselling suggest that it's not being done very well. So that's another area of scandal. And abortions are not treated like any other surgical procedure in Australia, and I think that's a scandal too. Yes.
Sorry.
Janie. Yeah.
Do you think that as a doctor, if you're not willing to perform, say, an abortion, do you think referring is facilitating that?
Okay. Yes, the question is, if you as a doctor don't someone for an abortion, no, if you do refer someone from abortion, are you morally culpable? That's the question. Okay, this is pertinent because now in the United Kingdom, if anyone's studying for a diploma in obstetrics, if you refuse to do abortions, you will not be able to receive your certificate. It will be linked to your training. There has been suggestions that it will be linked to registration, but that hasn't gone through at this stage. You just won't get your certificate. So it is possible that this will have an impact on who can work as obstetricians. If you have, say if you're a GP or an obstetrician who doesn't do abortions, and someone comes to you and requests an abortion, I think that it's very important that we make sure that we explore the reasons why that person wanted an abortion, particularly because so many women have abortions because they feel they have no option. Your job will be to manage that, and you need to be familiar with the support mechanisms in your neighbourhood, which will give her practical things like somewhere to live if she's kicked out of home. The single mother's pension doesn't kick in until after the baby's born, so if she has to stop working before the baby's born, she's going to need some financial help. She will need moral support. So you need to make sure that women aren't having abortions on your watch because they feel there's no option. They need to know there is an option. If a mentally competent adult female in Australia requests an abortion, it is illegal for you to try and stop her. Personally, I think that given the importance of relationships in Christian thinking and the need for the gospel above any behavioural problems people have, we can't expect people to behave like Christians if they don't have the Holy Spirit. So I think that if someone is fully informed, you have made them aware of all their options and they still want abortion, that I would think it is ethically okay to refer them and maintain the relationship, hopefully, with reaching them with the gospel, particularly as there's a high rate of psychological problems after the abortion, and they could well need your support. However, if you personally feel that despite that argument, you would feel morally culpable if you did refer someone for an abortion, you should not go against your conscience. We're told that that is the wrong thing to do. And you should just not go into obstetrics if it's going to be linked to registration, or you just need to have a notice in your waiting room saying that you're not involved with those things, or work at a Catholic hospital because they won't allow you to do them even if you wanted to. So there are ways around it, but just, that's what I mean, be creative. There are ways around these things. But I personally think that we have to remember that non-Christians don't behave like Christians for a reason, and maintaining relationships is important. We shouldn't live in Christian.
So I think we have time for one more question. So is there any of the... Yeah?
Sometimes stem cells are used in vaccines, so how do you approach that? Are they embryonic stem cells or different types of stem cells?
Okay, sometimes stem cells are used in vaccines. How do we know if they're embryonic stem cells or adult stem cells? We look it up on the internet.
I know I said that was the last one, but I've got one.
I was very on that one.
Yeah, but we've had a lot of questions, so I'm pretty sure that most of your questions haven't been answered. So if we still have questions, where would we go to find out more information?
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because the reason I wrote the book was so I wouldn't have to give these talks anymore. Look, I go into enormous detail on some of these topics in the book, and the book is there as a resource. I think if you're planning to go into medicine, if you're planning to be involved in pastoral care in your church, you really should familiarise yourself with this. My book just focused on beginning of life. There's another good book by John White, who's a colleague of mine in the UK, who's written a book called Matters of Life and Death, and it's less scientific. It's not fully referenced, but it's a shorter read, and it looks at beginning and end of life as well. But I think that educated young Christians really should try and familiarise themselves with some of these topics, and that certainly is going to be a great source of information. If you really have a pressing problem that you feel you need to know the answer to much sooner, I'll be here for a little while, and I can also give you my email address, and you can email me a question if it's important to be answered quickly, because it is. But thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. A group of us are starting up a network for Christian medical ethics, which will be an information resource and also an opportunity for regular meetings for people who are interested in Christian medical ethics. If you would like to be on our mailing list to find out how it develops, there's a pad down at the name and email. We'll be informed of what's going on, and we won't give the emails to anyone else, and if you decide that you don't want to be involved, just let us know, we'll take you off the list. But we're hoping that we will be able to help Christians access reliable information more easily. Thank you. Thanks.